Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our series in resilience and steadiness. For many of us, this is week 4 of this very new way of life. Week 4 of many of us staying home. I woke this morning to what I can only describe as fear rhetoric. If any of you tuned into the news at the start of your day, you may have noticed words like devastating. You may have noticed words like we are at the start of our doomsday. You know, this idea that this week and possibly the next 2 weeks here in the United States are going to be devastating in terms of the acceleration of cases of the virus and deaths. So I was wondering, I got very curious about the fact that this morning, as I was hearing that kind of language, I just took it in with a great sense of ease and calm. And I asked myself, why is that? And I was quickly reminded of how critical my morning practices are, or what I call my morning rituals. And I know that you all have or likely have morning rituals, but you might not really identify them as stuff. They're ways that you come into your day that just make you feel good, that kind of help to ground and stabilize you. And if you don't have morning rituals or a morning practice, I strongly recommend that you just take, even if it's a few minutes at the start of each day, to make a decision about how you're going to meet whatever is about to enter into your orbit on any given day. Very quickly, my morning practice includes the following. I do not set my feet on the floor from bed until I do what I call plugging in. And for me, plugging in means getting very, very connected to the God of my understanding. And that's sometimes through prayer, not formal prayer. Sometimes it's through just a meditation practice that I do right in bed, but mostly it's through these words, which is asking that I am aware as I move through my day in my speech, in my behavior, in my thinking. I am aware of the presence of a higher power. That's all I ask for. That's usually followed by the ritual of making coffee, which for me is really sacred. There's something about the making of coffee, and for some of you, it might be the brewing of your morning tea that's really beautiful. I'm very aware as I'm making coffee of how it smells. I'm aware of the sound of the grinder. I'm aware of the sound of the drip. The first couple of sips. I cook for my dog. She's diabetic, so I cook all of her meals. So there's the cooking of the morning meal, which always feels sacred because it's a way of caring for her in a way that truly sustains her life. And then there's my formal meditation practice. And I have a formal meditation practice. You don't have to have one, but I do. And I have had one for many years. And it usually runs between 20 and 30 minutes, just depending on what I feel I most need. And then I'm ready to start my day. And that might sound like a lot, and it doesn't have to be that much. That's just my ritual. But I have been ever more committed to it over the course of the last 3 weeks, because I think that if I heard the words devastating, doomsday, sort of this sense of urgency that, you know, this has been the calm before the storm, and now we're entering into the eye of the storm. If I had heard this 3 weeks ago, I don't know that I would have been as prepared as I was to hear those things today. So I just heard all of those words through a very calm and very still mind. So I just felt like I wanted to launch into today's session by kind of planting the seed of the importance of the morning ritual, your morning practices, to be aware of them, whatever they are for you, and they can be anything. But what grounds and settles you in such a way that you can launch into your day where you feel like you can really trust that you have what you need should words like devastating and doomsday start entering into your consciousness. So yesterday I was having a session with one of my coaching clients, and she reminded me of a really important idea that Dr. Brené Brown talks about in her book, Braving the Wilderness. And Brené Brown talks about the importance of having a really strong back and a very soft front. A really strong back and a very soft front. And I remembered when I first encountered that idea, how meaningful it was for me because I could feel it in my body. I knew what she was talking about. That part of bravery and courage requires that you feel rock solid in yourself, that you have your own back, and yet you can still navigate through the world with this really open heart, this softness in the front. And I can think of no time in my own life where that idea has ever meant more than right now. Can we navigate what's happening with a strong back and a really soft front? Can we be simultaneously strong and grounded and open to it all? Can we hold it all? And that's really where I want to start today's session as we look at what does it mean to have relationship resilience. And we started that last Wednesday. And I want to continue on along that track. So I'm going to get the slides up. And let me just put this on slideshow. All right. I need to go ahead, skip ahead here. All right. So last time, I wanted to emphasize this idea that we can think about the stress response, how we fight, how we get ready to run, flee, how we freeze, how we can fawn. We can look at that inside of ourselves. But we can also look at the stress response as it gets manifested in our close relationships when we are in an environment where external forces are such that they're very, very stressful. And how important it is that we understand that now more than ever, we really need each other because we need to lean on each other. But at the same time, we might find that we're living in very different kinds of relational structures. Like for the first time in your whole history, you might be working at home full time with your spouse or your significant other. You might be homeschooling, so the kids are home all the time. And although there are a lot of really wonderful qualities about that, it can really turn our relationships upside down. We don't necessarily know how to walk the path of this kind of shared living. At the same time, some of us are also experiencing a different kind of relational structure in the sense that we might live alone and we might be cut off from physical contact with the people in our lives that we love and care about. So it's really important that we're really mindful of taking very good care of our relationships. If you remember from last time, there were 3 things that I want you to kind of hold in the forefront of your consciousness. And that is, am I tending to my relationship? Am I taking good care of it? Number 2, am I prioritizing it? What priority does it have in my life? And number 3, am I protecting it? Now, these things are important all the time. Tending, prioritizing, and protection. But most of the time, we're just living our lives. And the last thing we're thinking about is, when was the last time I watered my relationship? I nurtured it. When was the last time I exposed it to sunlight? When was the last time that it actually had some growth? When was the last time we brought it into the forefront of our lives as opposed to having it back on the back burner? when is the last time that we actively had a conversation about how do we protect this thing that we built together in such a way that it stays strong, that it's thriving, that it continues to serve us regardless of what's happening around us. So one of the things that I talked about was, okay, we spent quite a bit of time talking about how the fight stress response can show up in your close relationships. We talked about increased levels of anger, irritation, agitation. We talked about the deeper meaning of anger, always remembering that when someone is angry, if we kind of step aside and look at it and ask ourselves, okay, in what way right now is my child, is my spouse, is my partner in all of this anger really trying to tell me that he's really afraid, that she feels really hopeless and helpless, out of control in this situation, or that he or she is just feeling really hurt. And in this case, and what's going on now, I would also ask you to consider with the hurt piece, in what way is this person that I love who's really angry right now, deeply grieving? So we talked about how fight might be showing up right now. How does fleeing show up? We talked about how do you leave your relationship when you're still living in the same house together? You know, how do you take yourself out of the relationship by getting stuck in the past, too worried and focused on the future, or just so overwhelmed by everything that's happening that you just completely become numb? And it's as if you are only there in body. You know, the experience of that is looking to someone you love and having a conversation and realizing that there's just that vacant stare in their eyes. They are not with you. They are not present. But one of the most profound manifestations of fleeing is what I call the drift. And I used this image last time. And to remind you that the drift is most often talked about in terms of intimate relationships, when couples, partners drift apart. There's lots of reasons why that happens. But it can also happen in a relationship between a parent and a child. We might notice drifting occurring as our children are going through major life transitions, puberty, their young adult years. We notice the drift occurring very naturally when our child is asserting their independence and their autonomy, which is something that, by the way, they really need to do. It's part of their development, but we can feel that heartbreaking distance from them. So the drift can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Just as means of review, we looked at the hectic nature of our life can cause the drift. I just put the relationship on the back burner. I'm not tending to it. Every time we decide, all right, we've had this fight 50 times, it's going back under the carpet. We're not resolving this conflict. This is very common, by the way. Every time I feel hurt and don't express it, or you feel hurt and don't express it, resentment that builds and builds and builds, I promise you will lead to drifting. Whenever there is a loss of trust or respect, you're very vulnerable to the drift. Every time I don't communicate clearly what I most need and want in the relationship, or you don't, every time I fail to communicate what I dream about, what I aspire to, or if you fail to do that, we run the risk of drifting. But I think more than anything else, and this is really important for our purposes, what contributes most profoundly to drifting is stress that is left untended to. I can say this with quite a bit of confidence from my own experience. But I can also say this from the experiences that I've had as a relational coach with couples that were experiencing what I call discernment. And to be in a discernment phase is to be making a decision about whether you're going to stay together or part. And some couples do this. They actually, they call it separation. We're trying to figure out, are we going to stay together or are we going to end this relationship? More often than not, when I'm helping them through that discernment phase, when I ask them, when did you first start thinking about whether you were going to leave or stay? Like, when did this option of leaving even sort of come up? What was happening in the relationship or around you when that even came up as a possibility? If they can look back, more often than not, they can see that they were in some sort of very profoundly stressful situation that may have had nothing to do with each other. It might have been a sick child. It might have been a change in their financial situation. It might have been that one of the partners was grieving some sort of loss. But more often than not, there was this really big, profound stressor that was occurring that was not tended to. And left untended, we will start to drift away from each other. So really important for our purposes, as we all are navigating in the context of this big stressor that's out there, that we tend to that stress in a way that works best for us, and that we're very mindful of the way in which those stressors might be entering into the relationship. I shared this slide last time. I'll just highlight a couple of things that are here. You can kind of ask yourself, when was the last time I asked any of these questions to my loved one? And when was the last time these questions were asked of me? What do you most care about? What happened to you? What has life been like for you over the course of the last 10 years, even though we've been living together, but we haven't talked about how we're experiencing all of this? What have I failed to notice about you, about your growth, about what you care about? What are you still dreaming about? What do you want to aspire to? And do I still know how to love you? And I think I mentioned that one of the most beautiful questions you can ask of anyone you love is, am I loving you well? Or how can I love you better? And to imagine how that might feel if that question were asked of you, and how would you answer? It's a really beautiful question to very intentionally decide this is a question that we're going to ask each other often. It's going to become part of the way that we talk to each other. So those are all signs of the drift. Be very mindful. Again, part of what we're talking about here, when we talk about resilience, part about building my own resiliency is being very aware of the things that I'm vulnerable to and making sure that I feel well protected. That the relation, in this case, the relationship is well protected against these external forces of stress that can come in, activate the stress response, and then show up in the relationship. So how do we freeze? We talked about how fight shows up. We talked about how fleeing shows up. How does freezing show up? Freezing can show up as, this has been unmanaged for so long that I'm just numb. This is like the couple or the family that's just going through the motions. This is the couple or the family that shows up at the beautiful dinner party, and everyone looks at them like they're the perfect family, yet behind closed doors, when they go home, everyone goes to their rooms and closes the door. It's just, we are all just sort of going through the motions, living on automatic pilot, two ships passing in the night, Or another manifestation of that is what I call we construct the wall of pleasantness. I live in my relational life, I live a life of quiet desperation, yet I'm going to construct a wall of pleasantness. You will never know. You, my partner, will never know, because all you will see is my pleasantness. Those around me will never know. That is a form of freezing. And sadly, there are plenty of people that live this way in their love relationships and in their families. Again, when I ask, when did you start freezing? When did you detach so much that you constructed this wall of pleasantness? When did you go on automatic pilot? Most people will be able to tell you a story in their relational history where something profoundly stressful was going on that was not tended to. Be careful of the freeze. So, the next slide is an important one, and I hesitated to include the image, but I had to because it's accurate. And it accurately portrays what John and Mary Gottman of the Gottman Institute, they're really actually very famous for this. If they were famous for anything, they are famous for what they deemed the 4 deadly horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. Don't be afraid of this, by the way. Having an awareness of this can have a profound impact on how you communicate and the kind of communication or dynamic that exists inside of your family, inside of your romantic, intimate relationship. And the 4 deadly horsemen of the relational apocalypse really make you mindful of the way that we communicate verbally, non-verbally, in our actions, in our behaviors, in our general energy. None of the 4 deadly horsemen, by the way, will surprise you. Criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. The first horseman that typically arrives is the voice, the energy, the presence of criticism. This is when we're picking on each other. This is when you irritate me to the degree, you agitate me to the degree that now I'm making it known. And again, this isn't just between 2 partners. This can also become part of a dynamic between a parent and a child. This is very lethal, by the way, in relationships between siblings. You have to be, as a parent, you want to be very careful when you start hearing the energy of criticism in the way that your children speak to each other, in the way that I speak to my partner, in the way that our family treats each other. Criticism can be pervasive in our family dynamic. Criticism starts to erode the strength of the relational structure. Remember, I talked about those 4 pillars that keep your relationship strong. Whatever you built the relationship on, if suddenly criticism begins to enter and becomes part of how you communicate with each other, you're starting to erode or fracture, destabilize the house of relationship. It follows then that if criticism is present, it's going to arouse defensiveness. It's one thing for you to give me feedback in a kind and loving way. It's another thing for you to be critical. They're 2 different, very, very different things. So if criticism is present and it becomes chronic, you better believe that people are going to come into defense mode. When I am in defense mode, forget about the open front. Forget about the soft open heart. Forget about intimacy to a deep degree even being possible. So defensiveness, when it's present, really starts to manifest itself in family members, spouses, partners, really being in fight mode. Just like, I am so ready to go. I am so ready for your next criticism. To the point that in order to defend myself adequately, I'm going to wake up in the morning defended and defensive, and I'm going to move throughout my day that way in reference to you. So imagine what that might feel like. Imagine to live inside of the relational system or dynamic where you're not only critical of each other, you're really defended against each other. I know you've all had this situation where you've been out in public with maybe a group of couples. Let's say there's 6 couples present, or 3 couples present, a total of 6 people. And suddenly the engagement, the dinner, let's say you're all having dinner together, gets really uncomfortable because 2 of the people are in this dynamic already. 2 of the horsemen are already present. They are not only critical of each other and defended against each other, but they're making it public. They speak and behave in these ways that everyone can see. That energy deeply impacts everyone else at the table. If it deeply impacts everyone else at the table, you can bet that it deeply impacts the lives and the emotional well-being of children, regardless of their age, who watch this dynamic between parents. It should be clear as I'm moving through this why the Gottmans might call these styles of communicating the 4 deadly horses. If criticism and defensiveness continue and just become a chronic part of your relational dynamic, you can then bet that contempt will follow. The reason that I have contempt in bold is because when contempt arrives, we are in crisis. When contempt arrives, many people have asked me, well, is there a way to reverse all of this? Absolutely. But by the time contempt arrives, you may need third-party intervention. Really difficult unless you're very, very mindful people and you're very committed. You sit down with each other and say, we cannot continue to be together in this way. By the time contempt arrives, contempt is destructive. I actually don't have words for what contempt sounds like. I only know how it feels. Contempt is not just erosive, it is completely destructive. If I have contempt for you, I likely don't trust you, and I certainly do not respect you. There's a scene in, I believe the movie was War of the Roses, where the 2 main characters who are divorcing are at a family dinner, and she is listening to the sound of her soon-to-be ex-husband chewing his food. And the mere sound of him chewing his food disgusts her, enrages her. It's sort of a funny moment in a film, but it sort of pretty accurately depicts the presence of the 3rd deadly horseman, contempt. following contempt, because criticism, defensiveness, and when contempt arrives, you can only live like this for so long. A human being can only withstand living like this for so long before they stonewall. And to stonewall is to build that fortress around yourself. Many, many people live like this. They live their whole relational lives like this. And the way that they survive is to stonewall. And that might mean we no longer sleep in the same bed anymore or bedroom anymore. And it's not because one of us snores. We are out in public as the happy couple, but that is certainly not the case at home. We might travel separately. There's are a lot of indicators of separation. Ultimately, however, to stonewall is to make a decision, whether it was conscious or not, that I'm no longer allowing my heart to live in this relationship because it's just too painful. What's really important about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is that they show up, again, not just in the words that we speak, they show up in the way that we are actually thinking about the other person or our family. They show up in the way we behave. They really show up. I can be very critical of you. I can be very defensive. I can express contempt, and I can stonewall completely through my body and my body language. I mean, you can be in the presence of 2 people, a couple, and you can see all of this without ever hearing them speak a word. So it's really important to know that these are forms of communicating. These are forms of expression that, when they are there, are indicators that, wow, we really need to prioritize this relationship. We need to give it some attention, and we need to be vigilant about protecting it from this kind of expression living in our relationship. By the way, these 4 ways of expression are very normal. We are human beings. When we are scared, we get critical, we get defensive, we can express contempt, we stonewall. When we are overwhelmed, when we are stressed. So why does this matter now? This matters now because we want to really start noticing this external circumstance called COVID-19, this pandemic, has made me super critical of my partner or of my child. I'm just picking all the time. And I'm wondering, why is my partner so defensive? Well, maybe it's because of the way that I'm communicating. Why is there suddenly contempt present? How and in what ways have we started stonewalling? So these can be a game changer because they become part of your conscious awareness, and they just make you acutely mindful of how you are conducting yourself with people that you love. If you're interested in learning more about the 4 deadly horsemen of the apocalypse, I strongly recommend that you just Google that term, the 4 deadly horsemen of the apocalypse. It will take you to the Gottman, will take you to a lot of places, but there's a wonderful, elaborate blog article about the 4 deadly horsemen in great detail, much more detail than I offered here, that's written by the Gottmans. But also there's a follow-up blog called What Are the Antidotes to the 4 Horsemen? And this is just a brief summary. So how do I combat the 4 horsemen if they've arrived or if they're living in our relationship? Just know that the combat to criticism is always praise, always affirmation, always gratitude. And I mentioned last time that the Gottmans really, really value very, very highly appreciation. And this is particularly important in the lives of our children, that we put them in positions where they are allowed to do things that we get to praise and appreciate them for. For example, if you're all finding yourselves living together now 24/7, something as simple as, having your 3 or 4-year-old make their bed in the best way that they know how, and then praising them for it, expressing gratitude and appreciation for the fact that they did that, is really powerful. Look for reasons to praise, especially if you feel or if you've noticed that, we're kind of picking on each other lately. Notice how transformative it is. I know that it might sound trite or trivial, but it's really powerful. Defensiveness, really important. If you find that you're just ready to go to combat, especially with your teenager or your overbearing parent or your spouse or partner, tell yourself right now, to the degree that it's possible for me, I am going to maintain that soft front. I am committed to openness because I am committed to our connection. Even when things are really hard, my priority is to remain connected to you. Just decide that that's the way it's going to be. Make that commitment to yourself. And then start thinking about, what do I need to do? In what ways do I need to be mindful every time I find myself contracting into defense? Because defense is a contracted state. Think about it. When you're getting ready to fight, you are not opening your arms. You're not expanding the space of your chest and your lungs and your heart. Physically, you're not. You are contracting, or you're running in the other direction. There's no heart in it. That's why I always say, be careful about being defensive and being in a state of being defended. Those are heart states, relationally speaking. Sometimes this means, especially if I'm really defensive these days, just taking a period of time, maybe 3 times per day, sitting yourself down, closing your eyes, dropping your shoulders, bringing them back, and just saying, soften, soften, soften. Contempt. The Gottmans give a lot of advice about contempt, but the only thing I'll say about it is be uncompromising about contempt not being present in the way you communicate. It's just not allowed here. And if it's here, we have permission to call it out. I'm sensing the energy of contempt from you coming in my direction. I'm calling it out. I see you two, children, siblings, speaking to each other in ways that are contemptuous, uncompromising. We're not allowed here. We don't talk to each other like that here. And then stonewalling. Unless the circumstances dictate it, and there are lots of reasons that we must leave. The preventative against stonewalling is making the decision inside of your relationship. This is especially true of long-term committed partnerships. No one leaves. No one leaves. And I don't mean no one physically walks out of the room, although it can mean that. I mean, no one leaves in the sense that I'm going to build the fortress around my heart, because that's one of the ways I leave, and never tell you about it. So think about the possibility of making a decision consciously and intentionally that during this really stressful time, and then all the time, that we will do our best to communicate in ways that are on the right side of this list. Praise, affirmation, gratitude, appreciation, openness, remaining committed to the connection even when it's really hard, uncompromising about contempt. It's not permitted. It doesn't belong here. It has no place in our home. Preventative against stonewalling. Nobody leaves. So when I find myself leaving by shutting down, stonewalling, maybe I have permission to say to you, I need you to know I'm this close to leaving. And so we need to take a pause here so that I can come back. There is light. This is hard. This is hard stuff, especially when we're in the midst of really hard stuff. So here are some tools and strategies. Of course, being aware of the importance of being mindful of the drift and knowing the 4 horsemen and knowing how to combat those horsemen or what the antidote is. What else can we do? First and foremost, and this was one of the opening slides to this whole training and resiliency, is remembering now more than ever we need each other. So let's acknowledge that, and let's just start there or here. We need each other. Step 2, I love this. I think that in my history of teaching about relationships, mostly in undergraduate classrooms, when I hear from students that were in my classes 30 years ago that say, I found the notebook from interpersonal communication and I'm married now and I have kids now and I looked through that notebook and I see how much this content is present in how we built our relationship. This is likely what they remember most. And it's so simple, but it's so powerful. It's a form of conscious communication, mindful communication, that's called confirmation. And I can describe what confirmation is, but it's difficult because we know confirmation when we feel it. So as a way of teaching it, I came up with what I call the message of confirmation. And this is what it sounds like. I see you, I hear you, I acknowledge you. What you say, think, and feel matters, and it has value. I don't have to agree with it, but you matter. If you ever wanted to fast track yourself into that softened front, make a decision that on an ongoing basis, as often as you can, you will communicate the message of confirmation. By the way, this does not mean that you're going to turn off the video or leave the meeting today and go to your loved one and say, I see you, I hear you, I acknowledge you. What you say, think, and feel matters and has value. You're not going to say that. You can, but they might wonder, what happened to you? What is this all about? There are ways of communicating this without ever speaking a word. The most beautiful illustration of confirmation that I ever heard was when I was very, very young and just really starting out in my career as a university professor. I was teaching at the University of South Florida, and I had a night class in relational studies. Several of my students were non-traditional students. They were much older than me. They had a lot more lived experience than I had. In many ways, I thought I had absolutely no right teaching them about relationships. But there was a woman in the class who, when I was teaching about confirmation and sort of the 4 pillars of what makes for a strong relationship, she raised her hand and she said, I want to share with you an act that my husband enacted for many, many, many years that illustrated for me how deeply I mattered to him. And they were married close to 30 years. And she said that he had died just 3 months prior to her coming into the class. And she said, one of the things my husband knew about me is that my beverage of choice every morning was freshly brewed iced tea. That was my beverage of choice. And she said, every morning of our marriage, no matter what was going on with the kids, with us, our finances, jobs, all of it, whatever, regardless of whatever stage we were at in our marriage, my husband got up before anyone else. He went downstairs, he brewed tea, he iced it so that when I came down the steps in the morning, at my breakfast seat was a freshly brewed glass of iced tea. And there were periods of time in our marriage where we really felt estranged. You know, there was stuff going on that was really big and really took a toll on our marriage. But no matter what, I knew that he saw me, he heard me, he acknowledged me. He knew that that iced tea mattered to me. He may not have been in agreement with me about the things that were going on in our lives, but I mattered to him. And one of the saddest things in my life right now is that when I come down the stairs in the morning, that iced tea isn't there. It was really a profound part of her grieving, to not feel that confirmation. And I've shared that story many, many times to illustrate many things. One of the things that it illustrates is how an act of caring for another person can mean so much, can matter so much, especially when we are in an environment where we're really scared and we're distracted and we're overwhelmed and we're just not feeling at our best. I see you means I'm present enough that I notice you. I see you means that no matter what's going on, I can look at you and I can see in your face that things aren't okay right now or that you're suffering. That I'm present enough that I can see that that iced tea makes you really happy, and I'm going to do more of those kinds of things. To be seen by another person, especially someone who claims to love you, is profound. I hear you means, yeah, I hear the words you're saying, but I hear you means I hear beyond everything you're saying. I hear you, who you really are, because sometimes the words you're speaking aren't what you mean at all. And I can listen through all of that so that when you tell me you're fine, I can hear that you're not, or whatever it is. You know, it's really about what we call dialogue. Dialogue means I listen so deeply because I'm listening for who you are. I'm listening for beyond what you say. It's really easy actually to do that with someone that we love and we're crazy about. It's much more difficult to truly hear the person in our life that we love, but we're sort of in disagreement with or in conflict with. I acknowledge you means you are not invisible to me. I acknowledge you're present. I acknowledge that you've walked into the room. I acknowledge that you are seated at the table. We see lack of acknowledgement a lot in couple relationships and in parent-child relationships. You know, when you and your partner might be talking about, what are you going to do? What are we going to do about this child of ours who's acting out? And the child is sitting right there. What are we going to do about him or her? When the answer to that is to look to him or her and say, what do you need? You're at the table here of our family life. What do you need? We want to acknowledge that. Whether you're 4 years old or 40 years old, you're here, and we acknowledge that. What you say, think, and feel matters and has value. I don't have to agree with it, but you always, always, always matter. That's the message of confirmation. Confirmation comes through in your words, in your actions. Think about the ritual of the iced tea. It is an action. There were no words attached to it. It was something that he did. It comes through in your energy. And it's very, very easy to sleepwalk right now, to sleepwalk through our lives, because our lives just right now can feel like just too much. It's very easy for us to go on automatic pilot. And when I'm on automatic pilot, I'm not seeing you, I'm not hearing you, I'm not acknowledging you, because I'm fried. Very difficult. But we want to keep the value of confirmation at the forefront of our consciousness and be very, very mindful of just our very energy. Is my energy confirming of these people in my life that mean so much to me? Make a decision about what your 4 pillars are going to be. This is something that's a really beautiful thing to do in a family. When you introduce, if you feel like your kids are old enough to understand this, like, hey, if our relationship was like a house that needs to be built on really strong foundation and has to be held up by 4 pillars. Some people like to think about this as walls, not the pillars, the walls, whatever analogy works for you. What would they be? What matters? What matters to us? Because we get to decide. We get to decide. As a couple, we get to decide. If you remember, these are the 4 pillars that matter to me. You might replace some of these things: trust, respect, authenticity, and genuine caring. And when I look at the last quality here, genuine caring, I bet that quality arose for me based on that story that student told so long ago. Because it was really the first time in my adult life, young adult life, they really understood the value of genuine acts of caring in marriages, in long-term committed relationships. So this is something that you can do with your partner or with your family, even in these days of quarantine. Like, let's sit down and talk about this. You know, let's have a date inside of our own home and talk about this. What are our pillars? Because the pillars then become a North Star of sorts. Like, let's check in. Are they compromised? Have they been fractured? Maybe we want to have a pillar called trust, but we can't right now because we really need to work on that. So consider that as a tool. I'm going to stop on this slide, but this is really about honoring what matters, and this is really connected to the pillars. And this is sort of a list of questions that, again, for our purposes here at Studio B, what does it mean to get very conscious and mindful, not only about the way we build our relationships, but how we sustain them? Or if they're broken, how we repair them? Or if they need radical change how we transform them. We can do this mindfully. So think about these questions in terms of yourself right now. What matters to me most during this period of time that we find ourselves in? What matters to you personally as an individual? And then what matters to us right now? And it doesn't have to be something really profound. Actually, the simpler, the better. What matters to us as a couple? What matters to us as a family? What matters to us as friends? You can apply it to any relationship that matters to you. What is the priority right now for each of us as individuals? In other words, let's say, for example, you are a couple that are working at home right now. What's a priority for you in terms of getting your work right or doing your work well right now? For your partner, a priority might be daily exercise or daily meditation time, or, what is a priority for you as individuals? What is a priority for your family right now? Maybe it's healthy food. Maybe it's movie night. Maybe it's regular bedtime. I don't know. If you're parenting, what are our parenting principles right now? Because our parenting principles right now might be different from what they were 2 months ago or 1 month ago. What are our parenting principles during a time that feels like an emergency? Again, what is the priority for each of us professionally right now? Because some of us are not only just trying to stay afloat professionally, but some of us might also be thinking about, gosh, what do I have to think about professionally in terms of what my profession even looks like on the other side of this? But don't let these questions sit in your mind by yourself. Don't be with them by yourself. Share them. And really important is this final question is, what do we each need from each other right now? Like, what do I need most from you? What do you need most from me? And commit to being very clear about that. Very clear. And if you ask this question of someone you love and they answer, and I need your love right now. Well, tell me what that means. Like, how does that look for you? How do you need my love right now? What does my love look like right now? Okay. So again, resiliency in relationship, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I would say that it requires of us that we become very conscious and mindful of all the ways that many of us were sleepwalking or on automatic pilot as we built the relationship in the first place. But now we can kind of go in and use some of these tools to build a kind of strength, a resilience in the relationship that may not have been there before. That's just going to carry us forward in ways that are really, really going to serve us quite well. So I want to end with a practice, just a 3-minute practice to kind of take us out. And this practice is just a contemplation on a quote that I read last time. So I'll just bring us in. I'm going to read the quote, the passage, and then just ask you to just allow your mind to settle in on it. Take it into your heart, let it soften through the heart, and then we will bring it to a close. I know that it's just about, well, it is 3 o'clock, so if you need to leave, go ahead. You can do that, and we'll see you tomorrow. But if not, and you want to spend just this last few minutes with us, please do. So let's just come into that very comfortable seat, or if it feels better for you to come into a lying down position, feel free to do that as well. And if you feel comfortable, please close your eyes. Or keep your gaze very soft, allowing the musculature around the eyes to soften. If you're in a seated position, just feel the touch of your feet against the floor, the weight of your body as it gives way into your seat. And if that central nervous system has been charged up today, just allow the shoulders to drop. And maybe bring them back just a little bit. And for just a moment, feeling that strong back and that soft, open front. This open heart, this open front, this softening through the heart allows us to let go of all of that defense. And so for the next several moments, even if it's just for this period of time that we're here together, allow the heart to soften. In all of this, trust that you have a good and compassionate nature, that you are part of the universe. You are made of stars. And when you look at your loved one, you see that your beloved is also made of stars and carries eternity inside. Looking in this way at ourselves and at others naturally calls forth reverence. You are both, you are all so sacred. We need each other. Whenever you're ready, and only when you're ready, open your eyes. Thank you for being here today. We'll see you tomorrow. Jen will be here to lead the practice, and you can also join her this evening at 7 for a beautiful yin yoga practice. Stay safe, stay well, stay sane, and love. I'll see you Wednesday. Namaste.